Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our May forum from the Fair Air Coalition. And today we're going to be talking about the role of civil society uh, in mitigating clean air and securing a healthy environment for everyone around the world. And we have a great speaker. His name is Robert Percival. Did I say that correctly? Robert Percival?
Yes, Percival, yeah.
He's joining us from Washington, D.C., and he is currently a professor at the University of Maryland. And he has done a lot of very awesome stuff related to air and to advocacy and collaborations internationally. And I would let him talk to you guys about it more. And whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, I really appreciate the invitation to speak to you guys, and it's great to meet you, and this is awesome what you're doing to educate people. I'm going to focus on air pollution, talk a little bit about the history of efforts to control it, and the absolutely vital role of civil society in trying to improve air quality. I don't know if you saw just a few weeks ago, the World Health Organization released its latest global database of air quality. And we here in the United States, I sent Pedro a copy of a lecture I gave a year ago at the University of Utah about the history of efforts to control air pollution in the United States. Our Clean Air Act has been a remarkable success story, in part because every time there was a critical decision that had to be made, the American people and our Congress voted in favor of making air quality better, despite the fact that the industry groups were saying it was going to be impossible, it was going to harm the economy, it was going to hurt the poor, it was going to put people out of work. And in fact, it's been a remarkable success because we've been able to have generally healthy air quality at the same time that we've had good economic success. Now, that has led many people in the US to assume, well, things must be getting better all over the world. But what the WHO reported in their latest data, and they now have air quality monitors in 103 countries, 3,000 cities. They're particularly interested in urban air pollution as more and more people move to cities. And they found that more than 80% of people living in these urban areas that monitor air pollution are exposed to unhealthy air quality. The WHO has its own guidelines for what constitutes acceptable levels of pollution. And they found that as you might expect, populations in low-income cities are the most impacted by this unhealthy air quality. They found that 98% of cities in low and middle-income countries with more than 100,000 inhabitants did not meet WHO air quality guidelines. In high-income countries, 56% of cities had unhealthy air quality. The WHO database is growing all the time. In the last 2 years, they've doubled the number of cities measuring air pollution levels. And I think one theme that sort of will run through my talk is that information is incredibly powerful. It helps to mobilize citizen activism. It helps to influence policymakers and make them do the right thing to improve air quality. And what's positive about what the WHO is reporting, even though it's kind of depressing news about the current state of air quality in a lot of countries, is that we're continually getting better and better information so that we can know the true facts about the state of air quality. Air quality has a really direct impact on human health. As the WHO says, that as air quality declines, the risks of stroke, heart disease, lung cancer, and chronic and acute respiratory diseases, including asthma, increases for people who are exposed to this unhealthy air quality. They actually found that overall in the last year, global air pollution levels have increased by 8%. The areas of the world that have the lowest urban air pollution are generally high-income countries in the US, Europe, and the Western Pacific. Eastern Mediterranean, Southeast Asian regions, as well as low-income countries in the Western Pacific, have ambient air quality levels that in some cases exceed the safe limits by 5 to 10 times, and they've been increasing in 2/3 of these cities. 3 million deaths per year are attributed to bad air quality. And one of the most dangerous forms of air pollution is particulate matter. And that's why there's been a lot of focus on initially PM10 and now PM2.5. And I'll tell the story about the remarkable change in Chinese policy towards PM2.5 that was spurred almost entirely by the reaction of the Chinese public to one staffer at the US Embassy in Beijing who started tweeting real-time data on levels of PM2.5. So it's clear we, despite substantial progress in the richest countries in the US and Europe, healthy air quality, which should be a basic human right. I mean, there are a lot of environmental problems where we have some choice about, our diet, what we eat, what we expose ourselves to, but we don't have any choice about breathing. So it's got to be the most basic human right that we want to ensure that air quality is good. I'll start by going back over sort of some of the history of air pollution. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, after the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, one of the biggest air pollution problems was caused by smelters, copper smelters, lead and zinc smelters. They didn't have any pollution controls at the time. And so almost every place where a smelter located, the pollution would be so bad that it would just visibly destroy the crops for miles around. And I teach environmental law, and some of the earliest cases involve citizens who went to court to try to stop the smelters from causing harm to their crops. In the United States, one of the most famous cases was in 1905 in the US Supreme Court, a case called Georgia versus Tennessee Copper, where the state of Georgia sued 2 copper smelters across the state line in Tennessee because of all the crop damage they had done in Georgia. And the US Supreme Court at the time was hearing the case directly because they have jurisdiction over disputes between states. And this was a dispute between Georgia and Tennessee. And the Supreme Court, in a famous opinion by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, said that states have the right to protect their citizens from exposure to air pollution that was causing them harm. And ultimately, the Supreme Court wrote an air pollution control injunction requiring the smelters to reduce their pollution. Now, what often happens at these critical junctures when a decision's being made about pollution controls, the industry group or the source of pollution will say, there's no technology, we just can't do it, it'll cost too much. And that's exactly what these smelters said. But what you also see throughout history is that every time we call their bluff and say, we don't care, you have to protect public health and stop the environmental harm, the technology then develops. And that's what happened in the Georgia versus Tennessee copper case. The smelters ultimately developed the first method to control sulfur emissions from copper smelters, the lead acid chamber method. And it was largely because they were afraid that ultimately they would simply be shut down by the courts if they kept causing harm. Now, fast forward to the early 20th century, the 1920s. In 1925, I'll show you the screen if I can here. Let's see, screen share. There. This chemist, Thomas Midgley, was famous for two reasons. He had two remarkable inventions. He invented tetraethyl lead to boost octane in gasoline, and chlorofluorocarbons. And at the time, they were considered great advances because chlorofluorocarbons greatly improved the safety of refrigeration technology. It wasn't until decades later that we realized that they destroyed the Earth's protective layer of ozone, and that the use of lead additives in gasoline, the tetraethyl lead, was greatly increasing lead poisoning and had to ultimately be phased out. During the 1920s, the U.S. Surgeon General held a conference to decide whether or not leaded gasoline should be banned after it was introduced. And this courageous health crusader, Alice Hamilton, who was the first female professor at Harvard Law School, argued that lead additives should be banned because she said the lead's going to get in the air, it's going to get fall on the ground, children will breathe it in, and it will increase lead poisoning. Ultimately, she proved to be right, but nevertheless, they decided in the 20s to let it go ahead. Now, sort of the ultimate air pollution disaster was taking place in the 1950s and early 1960s when the US was in a nuclear arms race between us and the Soviet Union. Some years we tested more than 50 nuclear weapons in the atmosphere at the Nevada test site. And as you can see from the slide, you could even see the mushroom clouds from the Las Vegas casinos. And this is a case where the real heroes were the scientists. Scientists started detecting that radiation, strontium-90, was building up in the food chain all over the world. And they warned the US and the Soviet Union, if we kept doing this, the whole planet was going to be in real jeopardy. And that actually helped produce the 1962 nuclear test ban agreement between the US and the Soviet Union, where they agreed to do all their testing underground. Of course, at the same time in the early 60s, as we were phasing out above ground nuclear testing, Rachel Carson, in her book Silent Spring, was warning about the dangers of pesticides building up in the environment. And it was really these three scientists, Claire Patterson from Caltech, Irving Selikoff, an epidemiologist at the Mount Sinai Medical Center, and Mario Molina and F. Sherwood Rowland, who warned the world that lead was building up in the environment and poisoning children, that asbestos exposure was causing hundreds of thousands of deaths of workers, particularly who had been exposed to it in shipyards during World War II. And Molina and Rowland were actually doing the first environmental impact statement for the space shuttle. And they came up with the theory that chlorofluorocarbons would destroy the Earth's protective layer of ozone. Now, in 1970, there was a mass movement in the US, the first Earth Day on April 22nd. Millions of people took to the streets and demanded action from Congress. And that resulted ultimately in the passage of our major environmental laws in the early 1970s, including the first big one was the Clean Air Act in 1970, where for the first time we set up a national regulatory program. The newly created Environmental Protection Agency was directed to ensure that air quality was healthy throughout the entire United States. And a couple of radical things happened. One was that everyone realized that as more and more people bought heavily polluting automobiles, that that was going to greatly increase air pollution in the United States. So Congress did something truly radical. It mandated that all new cars within 5 years had to have pollution controls that would reduce their emissions by 90%. The automobile manufacturer said, that's crazy. We have no technology that could possibly do that. But Congress said, we'll give you 5 years. If you don't develop the technology, you can't sell any more new cars. It was sort of a game of chicken with the auto industry. They did provide in the law that will give you 1 extra year if you're really in good faith trying to develop these controls, but you just haven't quite been able to do it yet. And it worked. The catalytic converter was invented, and the result was that we then were able to slash air pollution from cars. At the same time, the Congress realized we're going to have to progressively keep ratcheting it down because we're going to have more and more cars on the road. The other radical thing they did, and this has been a theme throughout U.S. environmental law, is to mandate that citizens could play a major role in the implementation and enforcement of the law by explicitly authorizing citizen suits. This is something that Chinese environmentalists have long sought, and they just got in the last few years, where the law now says that if EPA fails to perform a mandatory duty in issuing regulations to carry out the act, you can sue them, and a judge can require them to issue the regulations. And if any polluters are violating the law, you can sue them. And if you win, you can recover your attorney's fees. So citizens have played a major role in implementing and enforcing the environmental laws. Now, let's just for a moment go to the international level. And I'm going to show you another slide here. Sort of the dawn of the global environmental movement in recent years was the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. This was the first major gathering of world leaders to focus on environmental concerns. And at the time, it was the largest gathering of world leaders in history. It was attended by representatives of 113 countries, and it resulted in the nations of the world adopting what was called the Stockholm Declaration. Indira Gandhi was at the conference, and she had said initially that she was skeptical about environmental concerns. She said, when I see smoke coming out of a smokestack, I think that means jobs. And poverty is the biggest threat to people in developing countries. We need development. Why should we be concerned about the environment? But she came away from that conference realizing that India had centuries-old traditions with the Emperor Ashoka and Kautiya, who had been among the first global figures centuries ago to emphasize the importance of environmental protection. So the Stockholm Declaration declares that nations all have a responsibility to ensure that their activities within their jurisdiction or control don't cause damage to the environment in other nations. This then started a pattern of every 10 years, the nations of the world would get together. The most successful conference was in 1992, the Real Earth Summit. Now, shortly after the Stockholm Conference, these two scientists developed this theory that chlorofluorocarbons, because they were so stable, would, if released into the environment, work their way into the upper reaches of the atmosphere, where they would interact with the Earth's layer of protective ozone, and there would be a chemical reaction that would destroy that. That upper atmosphere layer of protective ozone filters out ultraviolet radiation that otherwise would greatly cause skin cancer. Now, at the time, one of the principal products containing CFCs were that they were used as propellant in deodorant sprays. Used to be that instead of using roll-on deodorants, everyone would spray under their armpits each morning. But when the public heard that that substance might be literally destroying the Earth's protective shield from ultraviolet radiation, they quickly stopped using those products. And that enabled EPA to quickly phase out uses of CFCs. The Europeans were very skeptical at the time. They thought this was some US plot to harm their economies. And when US environmentalists went to England and started campaigning that the European countries should take action to phase out CFCs, the British embassy asked the US government to make them come home. And the US government explained, well, we're a little different. We have this thing called free speech, and we can't control what our environmental activists say. Now, ultimately, this led to the adoption of the Vienna Framework Convention on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And what's really remarkable is the nations of the world acted even before they had solid confirmation that this theory was correct. Ultimately, scientists using satellite observations were able to find the hole in the ozone layer. But it was found 2 months after the Vienna Framework Convention was adopted. And in September 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed, where the nations of the world all agreed to phase out these ozone-depleting substances. And this, by far, has been the most successful international environmental treaty. It created a mechanism where funds would be provided. This chart shows how first the developed countries would be the one to make the big cuts in CFC use. Increasing tax on CFC use as it was phased out would be used to create a fund to help developing countries afford the transition as well. And this was another example where the companies that made CFCs said, there's no good substitutes for them. It'll be real expensive. It'll take a long time. But once the treaty was signed, they then very quickly came up with substitutes that were much less expensive than anyone had expected. So that was another great success with global environmental law. And the greatest was the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. So throughout history, both at the domestic level and the international level, we've had these points in time where critical decisions had to be made concerning whether or not to strengthen environmental controls. And almost every step of the way, it was opposed. Now, in the US, our Clean Air Act was enacted in 1970. In 1974, the EPA used the new authorities it had under the Clean Air Act to at least set a limit on how much lead could be put in gasoline, because Claire Patterson's studies were showing that lead was building up in the environment, and that combustion of leaded gasoline was one of the principal sources of that. And the lead industry went to court in the US, and they argued that you couldn't prove that any specific individuals had been harmed by leaded gasoline. And it first went to a 3-judge panel, which ruled 2-1 in favor of the lead industry and struck down the regulations. But EPA then asked the entire 9-judge US Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit to hear the case. And by a vote of 5-4, they reversed and upheld the regulations. And the court, for the first time, directly embraced what's become known essentially as the precautionary principle. The notion that when you're dealing with preventative regulations, you shouldn't have to have the same level of proof. You should look at all the scientific evidence, but you don't have to prove that specific individuals were harmed. If you know lead is poisonous, you know combustion of leaded gasoline is the primary source of it in the atmosphere, you know we have this huge problem of childhood lead poisoning, it's a prudent step to at least set an upper limit on the amount of lead. And ultimately, EPA ended up phasing all lead out of gasoline in the United States. At the time, the industry said there'll be gasoline shortages, it'll hurt the poor and all this stuff. But it turns out that it's probably been the single most effective environmental regulation in the history of the US. And it now has been universally adopted. I think there are maybe 5 countries in the world that still have leaded gasoline. And the benefits to health have been enormous because lead is a potent neurotoxin. And as studies show, the more lead you have in your blood, the lower your IQ. And so we now are healthier, we are smarter on a global scale. A recent actual cost-benefit analysis found that the phase-out of leaded gasoline worldwide was producing $2 to $3 trillion a year in net benefits. So then after the second phase of environmental regulation sort of in the US, in the 1980s, you recall that in December 1984, often what happens when Congress adopts environmental legislation is it's in response to some kind of disaster. We have the 1989 Electron Valdez oil spill, so we adopt the 1990 Oil Pollution Act. In 1984, December, there's the Bhopal tragedy in India. An accident at a pesticide manufacturing plant releases a deadly chemical that kills thousands of people, permanently maims tens of thousands of other people. The US Congress responded to that by adopting in 1986 a law called the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. And what's remarkable about that act is it adopted a different approach. Instead of imposing specific controls on sources of pollution, what it did was it required companies every year to disclose how much of over 600 toxic chemicals they released into the environment every year. And this data had to be made available to the public in a form that anyone could access with their personal computer. And that was pretty revolutionary because it emphasized informational regulation, and it created kind of a global model for disclosing information. And when the first data came out, the chemical companies all said, we had no idea we were wasting so many valuable chemicals by polluting the environment with them. They pledged some voluntary releases. Years later, I'm in China in 2009, and I gave a lecture on toxic tort litigation there. And I'll share the screen with you here. This Chinese environmentalist named Ma Jun comes up to me after my lecture. He's got a copy of my environmental law casebook, and he wants me to sign it. And I said, well, why would you want me to sign it? He said, because page 438 changed my life. I'm like, how could that possibly be? He said, because that's where you told us about the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. And I got the idea that I was going to make a career out of using information to improve environmental conditions in China. And so he set up a website. Here's the data, how it can be presented, where anyone can find out who the big polluters in their neighborhood are. He set up this website where he tried to gather as much information as he could about polluters in China and make it available to the public online. And he ultimately ended up winning the Goldman Prize for Asia. And another one of his projects, which I think is a great model of citizen activism, is he got together a group of over 20 Chinese environmental groups. And he said, let's audit the supply chains of companies that supply major multinational electronic companies like Apple and Hewlett-Packard and see if they're complying with the environmental and labor laws. And they ended up finding that Apple was one of the worst offenders. Their suppliers in China were polluting like crazy. So he publicized this information. Apple tried to blow him off at first. They did a second report. And Apple then invited him to Cupertino, where he got them to agree that they would annually do independent environmental audits of their Chinese suppliers. Now, what's cool about this as a citizen activism strategy is it didn't involve any lawsuits or anything like that. All he did was publicize that Apple products were causing pollution in China when they're manufactured. And the company, realizing that this might hurt them in the marketplace, decided that they would then voluntarily do these audits. And because every company in China wants to be a supplier to Apple, if you're in the electronics business, it put the fear of God into those companies, because if they were found by the audit to have violations, Apple could stop doing business with them. And now every year, Apple has a supplier responsibility progress report where it details how many inspections there were. When they do the inspections, they give the workers these little cards with a number where they can call them when they're off work. And it's been incredibly effective as a strategy for helping green those supply chains. So that's another citizen activist strategy. Now, I wanted to also tell the story about the PM 2.5 in China. That one of the things that happened was that, I'll show you this slide here. Beijing is one of the most modern, sophisticated cities in the world, but people who work in the US Embassy there are given hardship pay because of the air pollution being so bad. And one day, a staffer in the embassy decided, why don't we set up our own PM 2.5, those are the tiniest particulates among the most dangerous to health, a monitor for it in the embassy. It's US territory, it's embassy ground, and start tweeting the results on a real-time basis. And the Chinese government immediately protested and told them to shut it down. And their response was, well, your citizens aren't able to access Twitter because it's banned by the Great Firewall, so why should you even worry about it? We're just doing this so that Americans back home can see how bad the air pollution is where we are. And of course, the sophisticated Chinese know how to get around the Great Firewall. They use the VPNs. And as a result, word started spreading that the Chinese government's official readings of PM 2.5 levels were just simply false. And as a result, the government was forced by public opinion to, for the first time, agree to controls on PM 2.5. And now China is a very unusual situation. It's a communist dictatorship, but the Communist Party is scared to death that environmental conditions are so bad that they're going to start causing social unrest. So as a result, they are very activist at trying to promote environmental progress. In the year 2 years ago, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang declared war on pollution. I think the central government is trying very hard to get a handle on it. The problem is their legal system so decentralized. Their EPA has their Ministry of Environmental Protection has about 300 employees. Our EPA has more than 15,000. So all the real decision making is done at the local level, the local environmental protection boards, and they're often affected by political pressures from local industry and government and corruption. So the central government's had a really hard time dealing with these problems. Now, a big change has happened in China. The public now, there have been these various campaigns, this I Will Test the Air Quality for the Homeland campaign in 2011. They use microblogs to raise money so that ordinary people could have air pollution monitors. And then the coolest thing is they now have these apps. I have one on my iPhone. I'm going to it right now. China Air Quality. You can actually go and get real-time data on what environmental conditions are like in 113 cities. So, for example, this is saying that air quality is actually good in Beijing today. I'm looking at my iPhone. This slide is an old one. In Shanghai, the government says that it's a level of 90, which they say is good, but the U.S. consulate monitors say it's actually 156, which is unhealthy. In Chengdu, the government says it's 20, which is excellent, but the U.S. consulate says it's 137, unhealthy for sensitive groups. So people can, use their iPhones now and find out what air quality is like. And here's other slides that show you how invariably the Chinese government still is giving a rosier reading. And I think that's in part because when they initially cited their monitors, the Chinese government did it in a way that they would be sampling at places where you wouldn't expect air quality to be as bad. Now, another amazing thing that happened last year, a very popular Chinese news anchor, Chai Jing, left her post when she got pregnant, and she decided to do her own documentary on how bad air pollution was in China. And it was done in the context of, I'm very concerned about the quality of the environment my child's going to be raised in. She showed photos of the ultrasound of her, the child growing within her. And what was incredible was within 2 days, there had been hundreds of millions of views of her film on the Chinese internet and something like 100 million comments on Chinese social media. The amazing thing is that the Chinese government and its internet censors left it up on the web for 6 days. They did finally take it down. And I attributed that to a fundamental disagreement within the high-level ranks of the Communist Party. They didn't know how to react. On the one hand, they want the public to be concerned about pollution and be pushing so that the local governments will take action. But on the other hand, they thought this was kind of getting out of hand and it might foment real civil unrest. But in the meantime, of course, her film, which is called Under the Dome, was translated into all kinds of language. You can now find it on YouTube, even though YouTube's banned in China. So another example of how media can be used in a way that will have a real impact. Now, to give you an example of how the Chinese central government is really fundamentally changing to try to improve environmental conditions because of all this public pressure. 2 years ago, I was actually invited to testify before the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. What had happened was that a dispute had broken out between the Ministry of Environmental Protection and the Standing Committee of the People's Congress, which was drafting amendments for the first time since 1989 to China's basic environmental law. And they were trying to figure out how can we make this law more enforceable. And the Standing Committee was told by the Ministry of Environmental Protection, one thing you should do is make penalties for violators be calculated on the basis of the days of violation. And the Standing Committee said, oh, that's too harsh. And the ministry said, well, that's what the US does. And the Standing Committee says, no, that's too harsh. We don't believe you. Prove it. So I got invited to testify before this committee. It was like a committee hearing in China. Can you imagine our Congress inviting Chinese experts to come and advise them? They created this list of questions, the first one being, is it really true you have daily penalties? And we quickly, within 3 days, got this industry lawyer, Jim Holtkamp, who represents mining companies in Salt Lake City, an NRDC lawyer, public interest lawyer from Los Angeles, David Pettit. And we basically all sang the same tune that this is a fundamental principle of U.S. environmental law from the start. It encourages companies to stop violating as soon as possible. And ultimately, they ended up amending the law and adopting almost everything we had recommended, and they now will have, for the first time, public interest litigation. So I was over in China with my students over spring break, and we went to a conference where some of our students presented papers at Shanghai Jiaotong University, and they had a panel of top public interest environmental lawyers in China. And for the first time in the many years I've been going to China, they were all cautiously optimistic. Courts were taking these cases. They had had the first judgments, significant judgments, millions of dollars against polluters. They'd even received natural resource damages for the first time. They were baffled as to what they should do with the money, but it really was kind of a sea change. And this, I think, also has played a key role in the success of the climate negotiations, because when the US and China in November 2014 shocked the rest of the world by announcing their own climate agreement between the two of them, because they're the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world, it sort of changed the political dynamic and helped contribute to the success of the negotiations in Paris in December. So we really have a very positive relationship with the Chinese when it comes to working together on environmental issues. I think one other reason for that is because the Chinese are very interested in the latest technology, and as part of that agreement, we've agreed to try to build an advanced carbon capture and storage power plant with them. It's now the case that 1.6 million Chinese a year are estimated to die prematurely because of exposure to air pollution. Some days they have incidents of air pollution that are so bad that they have to shut down the airports and roads and close the schools. So it really has become kind of a basic issue of public health that the public is very concerned about. And if you look at the history of US environmental law, when things got so bad that the Cuyahoga River was catching fire because it was so polluted in 1969, Earth Day soon followed, and we had all this new environmental legislation that has formed the basis for our infrastructure of environmental law today. Now, that's not to say that all this is going to be easy, because even though invariably the opponents of improving environmental protection have proved wrong with their doomsday projections about how it's going to harm the economy, you still hear the same refrain. And nothing galls me more than to hear companies claim that if they're required to reduce their pollution, it's going to hurt the poor. When what it really is going to hurt is they're afraid it's going to cost them more to do business. You see that in the climate negotiations. You have people like the fossil fuel industries and Bjorn Lomborg saying the poor don't need solar panels. And I think one of the most positive developments in recent years has been the involvement of the Pope with his encyclical Laudato Si, released last June, where he came right out and said the poor are going to be the greatest victims of climate change, and that it's the moral responsibility we have to future generations. And one of the cool things he does in that encyclical is he goes through the principal religious traditions around the world and shows how all of them have this notion of environmental stewardship, that we have a moral responsibility to protect people and to reach out to the poor and to protect them from being the victim. Five years ago, I was invited to a World Health Organization conference in Spain, where we adopted a resolution. It was all the top epidemiologists in the world, and we argued that there should be no more use of asbestos in the world. We've known for decades and decades what deadly diseases that substance causes. And yet, while most of the developed world has phased out asbestos use, China and India are still using asbestos. And as a result, the global decline in asbestos use has now kind of flattened out. So what's very hopeful about the World Health Assembly and the WHO's actions are that we're now increasing information, this global network of air quality monitors. We're now, through the World Health Assembly, WHO is coordinating health officials in all these countries, getting involved in advocating for protecting the environment, because you can do a lot more environmental protection of health if you improve environmental conditions that cause diseases. And so as our methods of communication and the amount of information improves, exactly what you guys are emphasizing, getting civil society to be involved in spreading the word, putting pressure on governments to take action. You can use history as a very powerful tool when people say it can't be done or it'll cost too much or it'll hurt the poor, by just showing those old arguments are always used and they've almost invariably proven to be false. And that's why in the United States we enjoy generally very healthy air quality, and conditions are improving, as the World Health Organization has documented. There's absolutely no reason in this day and age why other countries cannot do the same thing as well. Clean air should be a fundamental human right, and if the public can be mobilized to advocate for that, I think we'll reverse the depressing trend of air quality declining in a lot of the world in the very near future. Thanks.
That was amazing. Thank you very much. You gave so much information that is going to be very useful for a lot of our members. Like you said, it is always very good to look at history and see how other environmental accomplishments have been done, because that is the main, what backs us up, right? We're going to have a lot of arguments and a lot of people opposing to what we want, to what we stand for. And at the end of the day, people have won battles before. So that was very great. And also, thank you very much for sharing all the information about China. And that's actually an issue that I wanted to delve deeper into engaging conversation a little bit more. How long do you have? I don't want to keep you all night.
Oh, sure. I have until 10, so.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to, in a way, so the main concern, right, with us educating people around the world, or, you know, establishing this campaign in different countries, is how do we go about this without having I wouldn't say imperialistic, but having, oh yeah, well, we got to figure it out, we're better, kind of a case. How can you engage in a, I guess, partnership or collaboration like the US and China have done, without necessarily saying, oh, see, we did it, we're better, then you should copy us, in a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You know, I think it's how you approach it. The first thing you have to do is realize you can't just transplant some law or regulation from one society to another. Each country has its own different legal and political traditions, but we also have very similar environmental problems. And you don't have to say we're better than you because we did this. They know. You tell the stories about how bad things were back in the US, how we respond to them. The Chinese are probably more eager than any people I've met to learn from foreign experience. And one of the great things they're doing is sending thousands and thousands of Chinese students to the United States. And one of the first things that they realize is, first, they're appalled at the amount of gun violence in the United States because no one has guns in China. I always say, but you're safer, you won't get killed crossing the street like you will in Beijing because no one stops for pedestrians. but when they see the quality of the air, they just marvel because it's like they've never seen before. So they understand where we've been successful. Now, at the same time, there's some, interesting dialogue because they also say maybe democracy is not such a great thing if one of the two presidential candidates wants to abolish EPA. And if you can't get anything adopted through your Congress because one party that controls it is anti-environmental, whereas our National People's Congress, they can write any law they want and it'll be automatically adopted. So there's a lot of range for dialogue. One group in China that I might recommend you reach out to, citizen activism there's been amazing. There's a group called Greenstone. It was founded by two women when they were in college. And the purpose of the group was to mobilize Chinese college students to get them to pay more attention to environmental issues. And every summer I teach a course in comparative U.S.-China environmental law at Vermont Law School, and I take a group of the students over to China on a field trip. And this group's located in Nanjing, and we visited them on our field trip, and they're just operating out of one of their apartments. And yet they've been so influential because they're doing what Greenpeace in Beijing is doing as well. They're monitoring Chinese social media and using it to get more environmental consciousness. When we visited them, they had just discovered these government reports that showed that like several major companies in Nanjing were violating the environmental laws with their emissions. And so they started a campaign on social media for everyone to email the local environmental protection board and say, how come you're not prosecuting them? And boy, did that get attention right away. One thing we did to help them is they'd never seen an environmental impact statement. So we sent them a copy of what one looks like from the United States because they had been asked to comment on a Chinese one. And but it was just incredible because they were two young women in their 20s who are now, known all over China and looked up to by, this massive group of college students.
Oh, very cool. Thank you very much for sharing that as well. And this is, since you brought up the college student initiative, I guess also my next question would be, how can we, especially, we're all young people, we're everybody in this campaign, we're all students, we're all young, and technically a lot of us don't really have that much, political power. So how would you suggest as a law professor, how can we, through social media, through our own universities, our own resources that we do have readily available to us, how can we engage in change as it pertains to environment and also health? And this is not something just in the US. This campaign is a worldwide campaign. There's people that are involved from, Africa, from Europe, from all over the world. So how can we go about this in a way that it is, efficient from a youth perspective?
Yeah, I would say pick a couple of issues that you can focus on. And one thing that's very useful is if some countries have already done something like ban asbestos and the sky didn't fall and their economy is still doing well, it's kind of hard for the tired old arguments about we can't afford to do it to be successful. Pick something like that and focus on the countries that are still using it. Why haven't you banned asbestos? Everyone knows it's harmful. Yeah, the asbestos industry might come up with this junk science to say, oh, some kinds are harmful, but others are not, and the like. That would be one way to do it, or target a particular company who's doing something. Are you familiar with the story of the Girl Scouts and palm oil?
I am not.
There were two Girl Scouts who were selling Girl Scout cookies. They were 12 and 13 years old. And they noticed that in the ingredients it said palm oil. And then one of them was in an environmental class, and she heard that palm oil plantations in Indonesia and Malaysia were destroying the environment and the habitat of all these endangered species. So they started a campaign to say, why are we using palm oil if these plantations are destroying the environment? And they did a YouTube video. One of the things I do in my environmental law class is I have the class split up into small groups, and they all make videos about some environmental issue they care about. Their videos went viral, and they ended up getting the head of the Girl Scouts to pledge that they would only buy palm oil from certified suppliers who aren't harming the environment, and they would gradually reduce the amount they used. And they became environmental heroes at the age of but by the time they got to that level, they were like 13 and 14. And it's just like, that's what the environmental movement has always thrived on. Courageous people who picked an issue and had the facts on their side and had a clear, when I used to work for the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the things that we would always try to do was a group founded by scientists who were concerned about the buildup of DDT in the environment. And a bunch of scientists went out. They raised money through an ad in the New York Times, hired some lawyers, and the whole ethos of the organization was the scientists are in charge. And I was a young lawyer for them for 6 years. And I found that it was very powerful because my client had the facts on their side and was advocating. They always, their theory was, you can't just say no, come up with a better solution. Someone wants to do something. Well, there's an environmentally better way to do it. And if you have that on your side, then they can't portray you as wanting to shut down the economy or anything.
Right.
And it's been very successful.
Right. That is one of the biggest challenges. Also, as personally as a scientist, and I'm guessing a lot of scientists around the world, they the data is there, but sometimes how do we get people to understand the data and to understand, to believe us in a way that, for example, with this whole climate change situation, a lot of people think it's a hoax because they think it's going to harm their business. They're going to think it's going to harm the economy. And I can somewhat see that. But then as a scientist, right, we have the responsibility to convey the science and to tell and to teach these people about really the importance of climate change. So again, from a law perspective, how would you recommend scientists to approach these sort of issues? I guess, again, coming back to, hey, this is all there is. Do you think that there is a lack of, I guess, translators from very complex science into daily speech, and that's why people can understand it, and that's why people don't want to believe it? Or do you think it's the media? What do you think? There's that barrier between the two things. Is my question clear?
Yeah, I think scientists have to learn how to talk to the media. When I was at EDF, we had some foundation gave us a grant where they hired the public relations firms that train like political candidates, and we had a full day where we got media training. And I thought, oh, this is the ultimate cynicism. But it was like incredibly useful, the things that they taught me about how you should always have 3 points you want to make, and what to wear on television, how to talk in sound bites. Where humans aren't programmed to talk in sound bites. Once you realize that, suddenly I started getting quoted in the media much more, just because of that training. It's surprising how opinion can change rapidly. I'll give you an example. The day after President Obama took office, the State Department contacted me in January 2009. And they said, we'd like to send you on a lecture tour of China to talk up why the Chinese should agree to cap their greenhouse gas emissions at the Copenhagen conference, which was going to be December 2009. And I gave 17 talks in 14 different venues in all 6 consular regions of China over a space of a couple of weeks. And I got nothing but pushback from the Chinese at the Dalian Academy of Sciences. One prominent professor stood up after my talk and said, climate change isn't real. If it's real, it's not caused by humans. If it's real and caused by humans, we're already doing everything we should to deal with it in China. And then I actually found out that one of the top public interest environmental lawyers in China was saying climate change was a hoax and it was a Western plot to destroy the Chinese economy. He was so good on all these other environmental issues. And then 12 months later, June of 2010, I'm invited to China to a conference on how should we control our greenhouse gas emissions in China. Should we use our existing Clean Air Act or do we need new legislation? There had been a complete sea change in public opinion. And I think 2 things accounted for that. One was that the Chinese were very stung by how much criticism they got at Copenhagen for not agreeing to cap their emissions. But secondly, they discovered that green energy is a huge economic opportunity for them. They have advanced wind energy technology, solar energy technology, electric cars, and they realized it's in our economic interests, and we're among the few countries in the world that can really control our own fate with respect to climate change because we're the largest emitter in the world. So, change can happen. The problem of Congress and the climate change deniers, which I think is fueled by gerrymandering, that makes it hard to get rid of some of these real Neanderthals in Congress, is going to be with us for a while. But eventually, I was invited to speak by the Federalist Society to a group of Republican congressional aides a few years ago about climate change, and I said, "You guys know deep down inside you're on the wrong side of history when you deny climate change." And afterwards, the chief Republican aide to the Senate Environment Committee pulled me aside and said, "Look, I know you're right, but I can't say that or I get crucified. Is there anything you can recommend that we could do to help deal with the problem that wouldn't get us in trouble with our Republican bosses?" And I said, "Well, yeah, get rid of subsidies for fossil fuels. They're big on cutting out federal subsidies. So you got to try to figure out ways where there'll be some common ground. But in Washington, I have to say it's getting depressingly more polarized by the day in this election. Who knows? I used to clerk on the Supreme Court, and what's happening with the Supreme Court nominee is just unprecedented and appalling.
It is sad. It is quite sad. And some of these things that you were saying, it blows my mind that people are just rejecting all this data and all this hard work for their bosses, for their own personal reasons. So it's really sad. Hopefully, that's why we're doing this type of work, and we're trying to educate. We're trying to basically what other people have done to make environment and health a priority above all the other things. And does anybody else have questions? So Ariel, you have to.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. I have a question because I work a lot with manufacturing companies. I'm a mechanical engineer, so I was wondering, what do you see? What is the future of alternate source of energy? I think solar energy in the future is going to play a major role, but now hydrogen power vehicles may arrive because they release the Mirai. So what do you think? What is your view in that?
Well, I think we're going to make great strides towards more renewable energy, but if you look back over history, the problem has been that whenever that starts to happen, the price of oil goes down to the point where it kills off a lot of renewable energy projects. You saw that after the Arab oil shocks in the 70s, the price of oil skyrocketed. And then we created all these programs to subsidize renewable energy. And then throughout the 80s, the real price of oil steadily declined a lot of those programs. And that's why I've long advocated for what I call petroleum price stabilization tax that would solve this on gasoline by initially being imposed at a level that wouldn't affect anyone, but that would effectively set a floor under oil prices. So that if they declined, the real price declined at all. And this could know that competing fossil fuels were always going to cost a little bit more every year, and they could predict what that would be. It would come in extremely handy with the collapse in the oil prices recently. Now they're back to about $50 a barrel. And that's one measure. Ultimately, in the solar area, we seem to be making such great technological strides that the price of that is coming down to the point where we really may be on the dawn of a solar revolution. For the last 3 years, I've driven an electric car, and I've got 33,000 miles on it, which and I just absolutely love it. It's an incredible piece of technology.
Is it a Tesla?
Yes, it is.
When I get one, I'll make sure to get one when I graduate.
Well, they're coming down in price dramatically when they get the 3 out in 2 years.
Thank you so much for the information. I really appreciate it, and I really like the fact that you mentioned about the lead history. That was incredible, amazing background that you provided to us. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Anybody else has any questions? All right. You have to mute yourself, Marone.
Hi. So my name is Marwan, and I'm very happy to hear you and to attend this webinar. I am calling you from France, but I'm Moroccan, and I would like to share you my opinion about the climate change. We know that the climate change is a common problem in all the states. It's a challenges for humanity. We cannot lose these challenges. So actually, in your comparative presentation of the environmental law between the China and America and the U.S. legislation, we we consider that we have two different visions and two ways to answer of this problem. So I would like to ask you if we can to make an international law for environmental and to make the international sanction the true sanction. And secondly, so as a citizen of the world, so if you can to should fast themselves into citizens' lobby for climate protection and save the planet. So I'm sorry of my English; it's not very good, but I try it. But so thank you so much for your presentation. It's very interesting to know how the Chinese and U.S. environmental law and then.
Yeah, your English is great. Problem with the reason it was hard to get the Chinese to agree is that they would always say, well, it's true that we're now the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. Our country has more than 3 times as many people as the United States. So on a per capita basis, we're not. And yet their per capita emissions have also been rising so greatly that they now are at the same per capita level as the EU, when before they were way below. And they would also say historically, our historical emissions since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution are still way below what the US has contributed. But I think what ultimately resulted in us being able to forge an agreement with them is that they knew as well as we did that if they didn't cap their emissions, no matter what anyone else in the rest of the world would do, it would be a climate catastrophe for everyone. And that China itself would be one of the biggest victims of the damage that would be caused by global warming and climate change. So you have a situation where maybe it's the product of having enlightened dictatorship on this issue, that if you convince the right people in the party that this is a big problem, then they will change their attitude on it, and they have. And they've gone far beyond the U.S. and about to mobilize a national cap and trade system like we would have had if we had gotten legislation through Congress in 2009. But because we don't have that legislation, we're struggling with using our old-fashioned Clean Air Act to try to forge a program. But our EPA has done that in really creative ways. I think that most people who are intelligent consumers of science now are pretty convinced about the dangers of climate change because they're becoming so visible. With the, you saw in India a few weeks ago what they had the world's record heat and what's happening with sea level rise and the like. It's truly frightening. So most of the people who are still deniers are, in the United States Republican Party and probably get campaign contributions from the fossil fuel industries. Even them, even they are having to change their tune. And you saw a big battle today at the Exxon shareholders meeting.
So I have a quick question about China. Just any developing country really that is emitting a lot of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So there's this argument that a lot of people use, and they say that China and India, for example, are currently undergoing an industrial revolution that the West went through a few years ago. And they say that in a way as an excuse, right, to keep emitting. But then when somebody gives you that argument, what do you usually say back? In a way, people ask, what gives the West the right to say, okay, you need to stop emitting and you need to stop your industrialization because we say so, because the planet is going to be destroyed. But then still, at the end of the day, the laws that are enforced are the national laws. So how can you address that argument? Or how would you address it?
Well, on the one hand, you kind of go back to first principles of environmental law from the days of the 19th century nuisance suits against the smelters. The law has always been that you can be held liable if you cause foreseeable harm to another through your actions. Way back when we were doing a lot of emitting early on, the harm wasn't foreseeable. We didn't know what we know now. Now that it is, no one should proceed in the face of that to cause harm to others. And with India, one thing that they've been not nearly as good as China in recent years on climate change, but even they are gradually changing. And what they need to be sold on is that instead of following the same dirty technology path that we followed with our development, that they can jump ahead and use green technology in a way that will produce more economic benefits for them down the line, reduce the pollution that their citizens will be exposed to, and at the same time provide great economic benefits, particularly if fossil fuels increase in price in the future.
Does anybody else have any more questions for Robert? Mr. Anybody? No?
I actually have a question. So you mentioned the informational regulations that were pretty effective, but I was also wondering, it seems like there's got to be some challenges with any regulations, and I was wondering if there's any that are specific to informational regulations, and like how do you go about navigating them?
Yeah, the industry lawyers will come up with all kinds of creative ways to oppose certain things. Now, on the one hand, how can anyone be against information? It should be very non-threatening, especially if in these other countries you can make the argument these same companies are disclosing this stuff in the United States. They've been doing it since 1986. Why shouldn't they be able to do it in your country? The trend now in Washington is they're trying to get right-wing judges to buy the argument that it's a violation of their free speech rights if they're required to disclose certain information, that we're forcing them to speak. I think that's kind of a ridiculous argument. All we're doing is forcing them to warn people about chemicals they may be exposed to. And so that's kind of working its way through the courts. There was a very important amendment when the Dodd-Frank Act was adopted to respond to the financial crisis. They added two important new provisions. One that requires companies in the extractive industries to disclose any money they pay to a government official in another country. This is designed to ferret out bribery. And the other is a provision that says that certain minerals that can be prominently derived from areas of the Congo held by rebels, you have to tell whatever you know about the source of the minerals you use in your product, the idea being to wipe out the use of conflict minerals fueling these rebel groups that are engaged in so many nefarious things. And in both cases, the industry groups are saying, oh, this is a great burden, it violates our free speech rights. So lots of ongoing legal battles are happening. But the concept is very sound. And in fact, Gaddafi's former oil minister said that had that law been in effect and the companies been forced to disclose all the bribes they were paying to Gaddafi, it would have meant his downfall many years earlier than he was deposed.
Thank you. That's my question. I don't know if others have any other thoughts or questions.
Me?
Oh,
Hi. So I would like to ask you. As you know, every year the United Nations organize the conference, international conference about climate change, COP. The last year it was the COP21 held in Paris, and this year the COP22 will hold at Marrakesh in Morocco. So I'd like to ask you if you will attend in this conference.
I was at the COP in Paris. I'm not sure whether or not I'll go to Morocco. It's been great to be able to participate in those, because you see civil society groups, putting pressure on, making it clear to the delegates that they really want action on these things. But I know lots of people are planning to come to Marrakesh for the COP, and that's going to be a very important one. And really, I think what's important about that meeting is it will show whether Paris is just a paper agreement or whether it really is changing behavior around the world. One of the interesting things that happened in Paris is countries were acutely aware of the political problem in the United States, where we can't get any new environmental legislation through Congress. And so the Paris Agreement was carefully crafted in a way that doesn't require ratification by our U.S. Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans who deny climate change. We already have the authority to do everything we promised to do under existing law in the United States. What will be particularly interesting is how the U.S. presidential election will affect what happens in Marrakesh, because if Donald Trump's elected, all bets are off as to, he's already said he would renegotiate the Paris Agreement, I think, as though the U.S. controlled everything. He's got such an incredible ego. At the same time, he wants to abolish EPA. Who knows what he would really do? I suspect if Hillary Clinton's elected and she's still leading in the polls, you'll see, some pretty strong action by the U.S. to carry out its commitments there.
Maron, when is the COP22 in Marrakesh? What's the dates?
It's going to be a little earlier this year than in the past. I think it's the last weeks in November instead of.
Yes, it's the I think mid November. I shared with you now the website of the COP22 if you'd like to subscribe or to apply. If any person is interested to attend it.
All right, very cool. I thank you very much for sharing that with us as well, Maron. Or anybody else has any questions? No. So we had the leader. We are partnering with Youth Action, which is another campaign that we launched at the UN during our conference, the Millennium Campus Conference. But the leader never was able to make it to the call. I know that he had something urgent. He was in Istanbul and had to fly to Amsterdam, and he can't make it. So that's 100% fine. We might be done early. I just wanted to share a few thoughts. I was watching earlier this week a panel discussion from the UN Sustainable Development Summit that happened back in September in New York. And it was a small discussion on how civil society can, engage and also mitigate climate change, and not necessarily from an individual perspective, by riding a bike or by not using cars, but also from an advocacy and activism point of view. And I made a little quick PowerPoint that I can share with you guys. I made it real quick, but I think they have pretty good desktop one. Okay, I need to figure out how I'm gonna do it because I have 3 screens. So I don't know if you, tell me if you can see it. Can anybody tell me? I can't see this because I have 2 different screens. Julene, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yeah. I see it.
All right, so in a way, when we talk about civil society, sometimes we don't really know what civil society means. And basically what civil society is, for those that are not really aware of how the UN works, civil society is basically the non-government and the non-private sector side. So the NGOs, in that third sector, those citizens that manifest interest and, like you said, keep government accountable for a lot of their decisions and for laws in order to ensure the well-being of people. So civil society is fundamental to the world environment and human rights story. And there's one main challenge with this environment and human rights story as it pertains to clean air, is that there needs to be that science expertise to translate science into policy, which we were discussing before. It is something that sometimes people can't fully understand, but it is something that is very needed. So again, as young people who are, many of us are in universities, and Ariel is studying mechanical engineering, Julene is studying environmental science, I believe. So we're all, many of us are studying science. And as scientists and engineers, we have the responsibility to make this known to civil society so they can do something about it. Because 95% of environmental solutions to sustainability challenges are within that energy policy making and just in human rights policy making realm. So from a global perspective, civil societies have the power to give the input on those strategies that each country will have nationally, but also keep that global solution and that larger picture in perspective. And sometimes governments, national governments only focus about their own national issues, but I think it's a big part of civil societies, especially us, the new generation, as millennials, as we are connected to Facebook, we're aware of what's going on in the world. We need to keep our national governments to have that global perspective, to create that global solution. And collaboration is really important. And I think that this comes back to the Millennium Campus network, is that, we are all in this together, even though we come from different places with different opinions, different perspectives. At the end of the day, we have one planet, and this is something that we need to work together. And sharing strategies such as Mr. Percival or Dr. Percival shared with China and the US, sharing those environmental strategies is really crucial for the advancement, not just of economical partnerships, but also for the economical development and security of the people of the world. Land restoration is something very important. And the civil society and the role of the public sector, it is very intertwined. Our governments work for civil society, and civil society keeps that government accountable. So again, this is not a one-party issue. Civil society, the public sector, and government. The civil society, the public sector, and the private sector need to work together and collaborate, especially when it comes to climate change and clean air, because it's such a shared issue that crosses boundaries and affects people across the board. So again, the role of civil society is to push new laws. As Mr. Percival was saying, find that issue, focus on it, do your research, and just make it known. Any sort of chemical that is known to cause cancer and you see it somewhere that is being used in some product that you're using, you need to, if you care about it, make it known, advocate for it. And then through that, there will be new strategies and new programs. And that way we'll be able to protect the poorest and most vulnerable communities, which are usually the ones that are not as educated. So as people, as students that are in universities, that have the resources and the education to understand these complex scientific issues, we need to protect these poor people and these vulnerable communities. And again, keeping the governments accountable. And this is something that I heard in the forum. It was an argument that I thought was very interesting, and they were talking about, sometimes we need to stop thinking about that greater economy, because yes, the economy is very, very important, and it is what moves the world. But sometimes we just have to come back to the basics and talk about clean air, the air we breathe on a daily basis. The right to breathe is far more important and consequential for the great economy than the right to pollute. And when implementing policies, we must think outside of the box and don't be so narrow-minded, and think what that narrative and those efforts to advance the economy means for the citizens. Like what are going to be the health repercussions of those people that are also part of the economy. People go to work. People are the ones that drive the economy. And if people are sick, the economy also will collapse. So there's so many other aspects of this greater economy that a lot of people do not see. And it is our role as civil society to make that known. And again, it comes back to basics. It comes back to air, it comes back to water, comes back to health and the environment. I thought it was very interesting. They also shared that actually countries in the global south have a lot of coalitions that advocate for protection, especially when it comes to climate change. And for example, in Zimbabwe, the Climate Change Working Group has successfully advocated for a new national climate change strategy. So it is usually the richer countries that those coalitions don't necessarily have as much of a power because there's really large powers out there. And usually coalitions and civil society doesn't have the economical resources than other powers in rich countries have. However, through our passion, we can really make changes, just like people in the global south have accomplished. And this is a very cool report that I was reading, and it was actually very fascinating to hear about people in the global south making coalitions and fighting and making different changes in their government. Even people that didn't really fully understand the science, they did a lot of research and they were very passionate about it, and they actually made a lot of difference, a big difference, I meant. And this is something important to keep into consideration. Us, most of us, I live in the US, I'm from Spain, and people from the global north need to realize that we actually do have to learn, there's a lot to learn from countries in the global south. So this report is actually a very insightful way for us to learn how to make those coalitions and how to engage people in our society, in our universities, in our neighborhoods, in our communities to make a difference. So yeah, I recommend you read it when you have a moment, and that is it. All right. So does anybody else have any final comments?
Pedro, I was wondering, what kind of things are we working on right now to undo? Is it possible to undo this damage that we're providing to the that we're giving to the air?
Say it again.
Undoing the damage that we're doing right now to the pollution to the environment. Has there been any research in that?
So there is a lot of so I study air pollution. That's what I'm getting my PhD in. And there is so much being emitted into the atmosphere, and there's so much that we don't even know if it's good or bad, if it has any greenhouse effects, or whether if it's healthy for people to breathe in. For example, my research, I study emissions from wastewater treatment facilities, and what I study is that there's a lot of people actually getting sick around wastewater treatment facilities, and you don't see, there's not a lot of research being done on it. And again, it comes back to caring about that specific issue and do your own your own research and bringing up your data and your findings to government and to civil societies to together come up with regulations to protect people. And especially with my research, it is usually poor people that live around wastewater treatment plants. So, there is a lot of different processes that are unregulated and under monitored that as scientists need to look deeper in. And the science that is already known, like PM 2.5 or car emissions or power plants emissions, that science is out there. We know that emissions exist, but sometimes it doesn't get to the right people. It doesn't get to the right minds and to the people with power. So it is our task to advocate for the science that is out there and for what we learn in our classes and through our own research. So I recommend, again, like Mr. Percival was saying, choose your beast. There is so much to be done, especially when it comes to air pollution, because it is actually a very misunderstood and complex resource.
All right. Thank you so much, Pedro.
You're welcome. Any last comments? I keep Donovan updated about all the stuff that we said, because I think it'll be very good for him to share with his campaign and with the people that he's working with. So Also, anybody living in New York? No, you guys are far away. There is the first Science and Engineering Forum ever at the United Nations in June 7th. And the registration is still open. It's free to attend. So if you're gonna be in New York, June 7th and June 8th, come to United Nations, because we're gonna engage in discussions over it. If AR Coalition and Youth Action are gonna, engage in conversation with some other parties over there. All right. Well, again, thank you very much everyone for attending, and thank you a lot, Mr. Principal, for joining our call. Everything was incredible and very informative, and it's going to be very, very useful for our members.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, certainly.
All right, thank you, everyone.
We'll keep you updated. We'll keep you in the newsletters for future events and future findings and whatever we do in the future.
Okay. Have a good night, everyone. I'll be sending out the recording. Feel free to pass it along to your coworkers or colleagues or peers. Yeah, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions about the rest of our programming. We have a bunch of great webinars coming up as well, so you can keep an eye out for that. And yeah, thank you, Pedro, for facilitating wonderful webinars as always. Thank you, Bob, for tuning in, and thanks everyone else for joining us and sharing your questions and comments. We'll see you all very soon.
See you soon. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Mm-hmm.